The vilification of immigrants in general. Chapter 5, Murder and Lynchings. The vilification of immigrants in general, and Southern Italians in particular, by U.S. politicians and government officials, the Protestant clergy, yellow journalists, distinguished public figures, and even by presidents, if not representing the sentiments of all Native Americans, nevertheless sent a clear message to them that such creatures, these black Dagos, must be crushed out. Bigoted and violent nativists all over the country responded to the implications in these hateful messages. One incident typifies the intensity of the racism directed at the Italian immigrant. By 1890, New Orleans had become the home of a large group of Sicilian farm workers who, like most meridionali, harbored a mistrust of strangers and government authority, and who protected themselves in a tightly knit community closed to outsiders. Already resented and barely tolerated by the natives, and the subjects of scorn and suspicion for their secretive ways, the immigrants were the objects of widespread rumors of violent Black Hand activities, which increased the natives' paranoia and hatred. When the New Orleans chief of police, who was investigating extortion in the city's Little Italy, was assassinated, the long-simmering anti-Italian hysteria burst into an ugly frenzy. The police embarked on a wholesale roundup of Italians, while the then prevalent yellow press in America screamed for vengeance. One magazine article entitled, "What Shall We Do with the Dago?" Dago? Described the Sicilians as a stiletto-wielding threat to all decent Americans. 14 Italians were arrested and 6 tried for the murder. Although a New Orleans jury acquitted the 6, the 14 charged were not released. On March 14, 1891, a very respectable mob of 6,000 to 8,000 descended on the jail. 3 leading Louisiana citizens, a Mr. Parkerson, Mr. Dennegy, and Mr. Wycliffe, made short exhortatory speeches. It was announced that Mr. Houston would be the first lieutenant. A committee had procured rifles, pistols, and shotguns. In broad daylight, the angry throng followed its leaders to the parish prison. Once inside the walls of the prison, they shot down the crouching and shrieking Italians as they would have shot down street curs. Ignored by the police, the mob savagely beat the Italians, hanged 1 or 2 of them, and blasted the others into bloody heaps with an arsenal of guns. Though the killers were identified, no one was ever brought to justice. The New Orleans Cotton Exchange at once adopted resolutions declaring that the action of the mob was proper and justifiable. The Stock Exchange and the Board of Trade adopted similar resolutions. The New York Times editorial called the murdered prisoners sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins. Our own rattlesnakes are as good citizens as they. Lynch law was the only course open to the people of New Orleans. The crime had international repercussions and strong condemnation by the Italian government, which recalled its ambassador. But in America, many condoned it, including Theodore Roosevelt. Silvano Tomasi, in The Italian Experience in the United States, lists numerous other acts of nativist savagery against Italians. I'm not going to read all those. Okay, whatever. 4 killed, 1 lynched, 11 lynched, 1 lynched, 200 driven from the city, 6 murdered, 3 lynched, 5 lynched, 5 lynched, 4 driven from the city, 2 killed, 2 lynched, 1 shot, 1 lynched. 1874 to 1915. Since many cases of nativist violence against Guineas were not even reported, the list is understandably incomplete. A patent disregard of basic constitutional rights of Italian immigrants was the norm rather than an aberration. On March 4th, 1888, a Buffalo, New York newspaper reported that Captain Kilroy of the 1st Precinct sent consternation into the Italian colony last night in the persons of 42 stalwart bluecoats who were ordered to bring in all the male dago that looked as if they carried knives, and 325 swarthy-looking, gibbering foreigners were taken to the station house. 2 knives were recovered. In August 1920, mobs invaded the Italian section of West Frankfort, Illinois, dragged families from their home, beat them with weapons, and burned down whole rows of their houses. The Italians defended themselves. 500 state troopers were required to quell the ensuing 3-day battle, which left hundreds of Italians homeless. Work and bread. Most Southern Italians made the harrowing trek to America for their survival, which for the starving Meridionali meant work. America's booming industries hungered for cheap labor, and these new immigrants were certainly that, and more. The Meridionali brought with them a work ethic that was motivated by a grim determination to work for his family. Italians almost immediately earned a reputation as industrious, sacrificing, and uncomplaining laborers. The Industrial Commission on Immigrants reported in 1901 that the Italian can easily change habits and modes of work and adapt himself to different conditions. He is energetic and thrifty, and will work hard with little regard for the number of hours. When compared to other ethnic groups, he proved more desirable. Where an Irishman or a German demands meat, an Italian will work upon stale bread and beer, and although his physical efficiency is not as great, he works for so much less. The Southern agricultural interests recognized the benefits of Italian labor, also. They wanted to replace the black farm worker, whom they considered lazy and undependable, with the more reliable and productive Italian. Some Southern Italians, mostly Sicilians, were enticed to emigrate to Louisiana for plantation work, where they were grudgingly recognized as a superior labor force. One Louisiana newspaper in 1904 complimented the Italian for dramatically raising local land values because of their hard work and honesty. They are prompt to pay their debts at the stores, meet their paper at the banks when due, and sometimes before. I find it a great improvement and cheaper than the Negro labor of today. Even other immigrant groups appreciated the work ethic and personality of the Southern Italian. The Jews, who had taken over the New York City garment industry, found the new Italian immigrant to be hardworking, docile workers, and more importantly, willing to work for a low pay. More than hard work and a good attitude was needed, however, for the Italian paesani to receive a piece of the American pie. They arrived destitute, in poor health, and with the highest rate of illiteracy and the lowest percentage of professionals of any immigrant group, which altogether made them the least equipped to make it in America. At the turn of the century, 62% of Southern Italian immigrant men and 74% of the women were totally lacking the ability to read or write any recognized language or dialect. This lack of skills, basic education, or professions prevented them from demanding even survival wages. American employers categorized the Italians with Slavs and Negroes as non-white labor, unsuited for jobs demanding skill or intelligence. In 1895, this public notice recruiting workers for a state construction project was printed in New York City newspapers. Common labor, white, $1.30 to $1.50. Common labor, colored, $1.25 to $1.40. Common labor, Italian, $1.15 to $1.25. This gravitated the Italian laborer into the pick and shovel trades. These citified farm workers discovered that they were part of the store of unskilled labor that could be obtained at a good price. They were suitable for all sorts of work: railway building, canal work, road construction, the building of bridges and public works, The New York City subway system and many other municipal projects were built mainly by Italian American labor. Again, the working conditions these men encountered were as deplorable as the wages and forced them to organize. The treatment of these inarticulate, ignorant men finally became so unbearable that they organized themselves into a union under the leadership of Salvatore Ninfo, an intelligent English-speaking Italian youth of 21. The logic of events inevitably led to a strike for higher wages, shorter hours, and better conditions on the job. The strike was won, and its effects proved historic. It was the first effort at a union activity on the part of the Italians in America. The abundance of work was not enough to ease the plight of the Italian-American immigrant, however. By 1910, when $900 a year was considered necessary for a family of 5 to maintain a modest standard of living, the American Paisani family averaged $569, 15% less than his northern Italian counterpart. Only 2 other immigrant groups made less. To survive, the entire family had to work. In New York's Lower East Side, it was commonplace to find whole families working through the night merely to subsist. With rents $8 to $12 a month and living costs per individual a minimum of $5 a month, a garment worker could not support a family solely on his own pay. Consequently, his wife and children were sucked into the grim cycle of working and sleeping. Italian children were pulled out of school as early as possible. Boys went out to seek jobs. Girls remained at home to help their mothers do piecework and keep the house. In large cities like New York, however, their husbands and fathers permitted them to get jobs in carefully selected factories. These selected factories were actually sweatshops, dangerous fire traps with deplorable working conditions where low wages for long hours in abysmal surroundings were the common experience for immigrants, both men and women. They were dirty, dimly lit, with little or no ventilation, and operated with little regard for safety, where the owner frequently browbeat their female employees. Fines were imposed for talking, smiling, breaking a needle. To reach their quota, girls had to put in an 84-hour week at a wage averaging 5 cents an hour. Working pace hardly left time to eat or sleep. Factory wages were on a par with the existing conditions these women endured. One factory paid girls as high as 12 cents for a finished garment, each of which usually took 1.5 hours, but 5 to 7 cents per coat was a more common figure. When one scanned salaries, sums like $1.35 for a full week's work, and $9.37 for 13 weeks' labor crop up frequently. Most unbelievable is that many Italian women continued working 15 and 16-hour days in which all they received for their efforts was 50 or 60 cents. On March 25, 1911, a horrendous fire in one of these sweatshops killed scores of Jewish and Italian immigrant women and girls and exposed the world to these deplorable working conditions, and led to the beginning of legislative worker reform. The fire started in a rag bin on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, located at Green and Washington Streets in New York City. The owners had locked the exit doors to prevent the mostly female workers from leaving before they were dismissed or from stealing company time away from their drudgery. Bodies were found piled on top of each other at these doors. There were no sprinklers or fire extinguishers. Victims leaped to their death from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors to escape the inferno, many of them already on fire. 150 died. The building still stands as a monument to the greed of the owners and to the exploitation and abuse of immigrant workers all over America. Chapter 7. Housing. Like other immigrants who also faced deplorable working conditions and meager wages, Italians were greeted with yet another blow to their survival in America, one that would further mar the already tarnished image of the mythical golden land where the streets are paved with gold. Housing, if one could call it that, usually came in the form of the city slum tenement, a shoddily built, unsanitary fire trap, void of even the basic necessities, air, light, running water, sanitary facilities required for human habitation. Offering little protection from the elements, it was often blazing hot in summer and freezing in winter. Jacob Riis, the police reporter turned reformer, in his famous expose on New York City slums, brought to the world vivid descriptions and shocking photographs of the squalor that enveloped the arriving immigrants. I have in mind one Italian flat among many, a half underground hole in a South Fifth Avenue yard, reached by odd passageways through a tumble-down tenement that was always full of bad smells and scooting rats. Across the foul and slippery yard, down 3 steps made of charred timbers from some worse wreck, was this flat, where 5 children slept with their elders. How many of those there were, I never knew. There were 3 big family beds, and they nearly filled the room, leaving only patches of the mud floor visible. The walls were absolutely black with age and smoke. The plaster had fallen off in patches, and was green mold on the ceiling. And yet with it all, with the swarm of squirming youngsters that were as black as the floor they rolled upon, there was evidence of a desperate, if hopeless, groping after order, even neatness. The beds were made up as nicely as they could be, with the old quilts and pieces of carpet that served for covering. In Poverty Gap, where an Italian would be stoned as likely as not, there would have been a heap of dirty straw instead of beds. Cracked walls, sagging floors, and a total absence of fire exits were features of these neglected buildings, whose dingy, overcrowded rooms drew extortionate rents. Landlords bullied poor families with yearly rent increases and unpardonably brutal evictions. The tenement, a halfway house between the garbage dump and the bone factory, was the result of a tremendous housing shortage which drove up the rents of these hovels, 25 to 35% higher than that of apartments in fashionable uptown New York. The slumlords, unable to resist profits of 50 to 70% on their original investment, squeezed tenants mercilessly. Immigrant families were forced to group together to share expenses or to take in boarders, causing extreme overcrowding and adding to the misery. Reese reports his personal observations. Something like 40 families are packed into 5 old 2-story and attic houses that were built to hold 5, and out in the yards, additional crowds are accommodated in sheds built of all sorts of old boards and used as drying racks for the Italian tenants' stock. In a room not 13 feet either way slept 12 men and women, 2 or 3 in bunks set in a sort of alcove, the rest on the floor. The Mulberry Bend Tenements, located on Mulberry Street in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, was infamous for its maze of incredibly foul alleys. There the new arrivals lived in damp basements, leaky garrets, clammy cellars, and outhouses, and stables converted into dwellings. Every foot of the Bend reeked with abject misery, cruelty, shame, degradation, and crime. By day, a purgatory of unrelieved squalor. At night, the Bend became an inferno tenanted by the dregs of humanity. To the money-grubbing landlord, the Italian immigrant was a really desirable tenant, content to live in a pigsty, and submits to robbery at the hands of the rent collector without murmur. After paying these exorbitant rents, the Italian had little left to clothe and feed his family, much less improve his condition. He was caught in the vicious cycle of debt, which took its toll on his family. A staple for the immigrant diet was weak tea and stale bread. Reese certified by his own observations and official reports from slum doctors and health inspectors that hundreds of men, women, and children are every day starving to death in the tenements. The tenements were breeding grounds for a multitude of diseases which devastated the slum population. Most vulnerable were the children. Italian immigrant children suffered dearly for their Mezzogiorno heritage of malnutrition and starvation. Smallpox, cholera, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and influenza epidemics ran unchecked and ravaged immigrant neighborhoods. Consumption, pneumonia, and tuberculosis struck down prime-age adults. Measles, a mere inconvenience today, killed the most helpless. Infant mortality soared. A survey by the Bureau of Vital Statistics on the Barracks, a notorious group of slum dwellings on Manhattan's Lower East Side, indicated that in 1888, the adult death rate in a population of 320 over 5 years old was 15.62 per 1,000. The baby death rate, 325 per 1,000, or nearly one-third in a total of 40. As a matter of fact, 13 of the 40 had died that year. One of the more familiar sights on an immigrant street was the funeral hearse stopping where the white badge of mourning flutters from every second door, waiting for the many tiny unadorned coffins to be brought out. In the stifling July nights, when the big barracks are like fiery furnaces, life in the tenements spells death to an army of little ones whom the doctor's skill is powerless to save. There were houses in which as many as 8 little children had died in 5 months. Italians were not the only ones who suffered. The other immigrants and the native poor all shared in the misery of that era. Many poor American blacks lived in worse conditions, paid higher rents, and by 1920 their infant mortality rate was 50% higher than whites. How they survived. That the early Italian immigrants not only survived their horrendous experiences but managed to improve their lot and merge into the mainstream of American society is nothing short of remarkable. How did they endure their hardships and eventually become this new generation of Americans who would contribute so much to the strength and growth of their adopted country? For one thing, Southern Italian immigrants carried with them the strong concept of the family, La Familia, which had sustained them through centuries of oppression and subjugation in Italy. La Familia was an extended family, more tribal than familial, and was composed of all immediate and distant relatives, including godparents and close friends, who were called aunt and uncle. In this lay the source of the immigrant strength, the bedrock on which all else stood. Italians also stabilized their precarious existence by moving into neighborhoods already populated by Italian immigrants, called Little Italies, and the United States abounded with them. These urban ethnic ghettos formed a cocoon around the immigrant families, preserving their culture and providing most of the social and material needs necessary for existence. They so completely insulated the immigrant that some, although spending most of their lives in America, never attended school, rarely ventured outside of their immediate neighborhood, and spoke no English. These ghettos also spawned a network of various Italian social organizations which supplied a safety net of support. Together with their culture and national customs, the Italian immigrant brought their religious faiths, ceremonials, and festivals with them, which supplied a very important source of social and spiritual stability. Italian Catholicism, with its folk quality, vibrant with color and emotional intensity, comforted the immigrants with its familiarity and sustained them through their ordeals. Their connection to the church, influenced by pagan conquerors and based in part on mysticism and superstition, was both more practical and more emotional than the Irish-dominated American Catholic Church of the time. Almost everything about the beliefs and practices of the Italian immigrants puzzled, shocked, or scandalized the Irish, who found the Italian practices at best superstitious and alien, and at worst pagan and sacrilegious. Italian devotions and rituals fortified the already deep-seated bias against the Italians, and was expressed openly by the church hierarchy, as well as by religious on the local parish level. The residual Irish scorn for Italians and their form of Catholicism has been felt by the children and grandchildren of these Italian immigrant Catholics. As late as the 1960s, bias against Italians was still openly practiced by some Irish religious. My Neapolitan Sicilian wife and her sister, along with other Italian-American classmates, were demeaned in their Brooklyn Catholic schools by Irish-American nuns who called them guineas and wops in open classrooms. Despite this bias from their Irish Catholic brethren, Italians relied heavily on the anchor of their faith to steady them and to help them weather the storm constantly raging about them in this strange and hard land. Finally, there existed in the Southern Italian a characteristic trait which was perhaps the one single factor that would eventually ensure their success in America. One quality created and nurtured out of necessity from centuries of resistance to foreign invasion and occupation. To the Bourbons, it was resistance and obstinacy. To the reunification-turned government, it was rebellion and treason. A grim determination, an unflagging and tenacious fortitude. The American West called it true grit, embedded in the peasant psyche, which would guarantee the survival of their families, their culture, and their race. Conclusion. The story of the Southern Italian immigrant is an account of all the immigrants who suffered during the early period of mass immigration to America. They came by the millions, expecting to find a paradise, some carrying all they owned on their backs. Instead, many found equally bad or worse conditions than they left. Perhaps the Southern Italian bore more exploitation and deprivation than most, but it was only a matter of degree. That they endured the treachery of their countrymen, forced servitude, deplorable living and working conditions, violent racism, and the scorn and ridicule of nativist America is a tribute to their resolute perseverance. That they conquered these threats to their survival and became significant contributors to a great nation is extraordinary. In such an atmosphere, the capacity of so many immigrants to maintain and nurture mental and spiritual health was a tribute to the cohesiveness of the family and their resolute courage. Their children and grandchildren would reap the benefits of their suffering, improving their political, social, and economic status, and succeed in realizing the American dream. However, their successes were costly. Assimilating into the American mosaic, these Italian Americans disconnected from the source of their racial character, and lost or gave up the traditions, rituals, and folklore of their heritage. These expressions of their culture, the colorful street festivals with their costumed dancers, the solemn public processions of favorite saints, the strolling street musicians and singers, the sidewalk vendors, the gesturing men in passionate discussions in front of their social clubs, the familiarity and security of their Little Italy neighborhoods, the scores of children splashing in open hydrants, the melodious regional dialects echoing from the tenements, the aromas of local bakeries and homemade Southern Italian cooking, the churches filled with humble, devout men and women in black. These have mostly disappeared. Only vestiges remain of the visual imprints of those immigrants who settled here. But what of the substance of the people? Has the evaporation of these images signaled the end of that race in America? Has the Italian character, once hardened into tempered steel by the forge of centuries of adversity in Italy, and which withstood countless assaults in this new land, become so malleable and conforming as to be indistinguishable from the American personality? I recently attended the unveiling of a monument celebrating the 500th anniversary of the epic voyage of Christopher Columbus. The hundreds in attendance were the offspring of those who gave so much that their children might live in freedom without want. I thought then that it bodes well for America that the blood of their ancestors flows through their veins. That day, I saw mixed with their pride for that Genoese hero a glimpse of that quality that sustained those who made that treacherous voyage, because of the promise that their best hope lay across the sea. I saw etched in their faces that resolute courage, that quiet determination, true grit that ensured their survival and success in the land of fire. They are the faces of southern Italy, the Mezzogiorno, of those descended from generations who proved that they might be killed but never defeated or even changed. Their faces project the lines of Robert Browning. Open my heart and you will see, graved inside of it, Italy. December 16, 1992, Joseph A. Cuomo.